So area number two under this topic is to give you sort of an overview of where we're going. So it's based on two of the readings, the first chapter from the textbook, the Surratt book, and then the photocopied chapter that's on there from Robinson. Surratt's sort of mainstream first guy on the scene, first one to sort of figure out that this was going to be an area that academics would start talking about, and so he's had this book for a very long time. Robinson's more of a newcomer, and as you can glean pretty quickly from the book, takes a much more kind of critical, sort of liberal, leftist, almost radical view of the media. So I figured I'd give you both flavors. There is some overlap, but also some differences. So I'm just going to kind of hit the high points here. Hopefully we won't be that long. The starting point is to think about what media and mass media means. Nowadays, a lot of students I have tend to leap from media to news media. And they use those terms interchangeably, but media is much more broad, that the media includes, as the pointy-headed definition says, any of the channels of communication, information, or entertainment in society. So you think about all the things that includes, from music and television to, interactive video game. What's the kid, Call of Duty? I don't know why I let my kid play that. But I'm just amazed that you can sort of play an interactive game online with people from everywhere. Technology just amazes me. Anyhow, to sort of modern social media apps that kids use to communicate with each other. Snapchat and all the other stuff. So one of the sort of ways to break down media is to talk about legacy media, and then obviously what happened before, pre-legacy media, and what folks now call the sort of new media. Pre-legacy media would include things like theater, folk tales, myths, ballads. Even though they predate legacy media like TV and a film, we still have modern versions of them around. People still tell each other folk tales and urban legends, and a lot of them still have to do with crime. It's amazing how much content, even in these very old forms of media, were about crime, response to crime. My daughter was reading some Shakespeare. I can't remember if it was Othello. I don't remember which one it was, but every day on the way home from school, I'd get the sort of lowdown on what happened and what content and what they were reading about that day. And it's like, so-and-so killed so-and-so, and then they killed him, and they murdered them by revenge, and then the ghost murdered somebody else. And you're like, holy crap. It's almost all about murder and those sorts of things. The other one, the Narcoco Rio, became famous once again. If anybody has watched the series Breaking Bad, it gets to a point where the main character, as this Heisenberg drug dealer, gets so famous that Mexicans start composing these narco ballads, which are essentially ballads about drug traffickers. And I'm like, does that really exist? So at the time I Googled it up, and yep, it really exists. It's a sort of subgenre of northern Mexican ballads. So, one of the themes of this lecture in this class is that pretty much as long as we've had forms of media, they've included a healthy chunk of crime content. The legacy media is print media and visual media. And so, we've had newspapers around a lot earlier than the 1930s. The 1930s and that penny press is highlighted principally because they really upped the ante when it came to crime reporting. Prior to that, you had sort of pointy-headed newspapers that were geared more towards the upper class and issues that the upper class were thinking about. The penny press was the first time, and so there's a famous quote, I can't remember where it is, going back to sort of news reporting, there it is, in the 1500s, the quote in the Surratt book about how it hardly seems possible that a really first-rate murder, especially if it was complicated by an illicit love affair or hanging out when unreported. So what happened in the 1830s is that the technology moved to steam presses that allowed sort of cheap mass production of newspapers. And so rather than being a whopping 6 cents, they got down to 1 penny, which members of the lower and middle class could afford. The content gets geared towards that class of people, becomes much more sensationalized. In fact, the New York Sun is noteworthy as one of the early penny presses for producing the crime blotter. So just a list from police departments of all the crimes or the sensational crimes that occurred and the details about those crimes. And the crime blotter is still a feature of a lot of different newspapers out there. Penny presses also, so you think about who they're geared toward. They focused on class inequalities that resulted in crime, that the cases where justice was manipulated by the wealthy and they got off for things they did. So yellow journalism was a particular flavor of the penny press that really sort of focused on the sensational and the salacious details about crimes, the axe murderer, and sort of really played up the lurid details of crimes. It's the forerunner, it's the tabloid journalism, essentially. But all these sort of mass marketed print medias, if you look through the Surratt book, like I said, a good chunk of them focused on crime. You think of comic books. The whole superhero genre of comic books are vigilantes fighting crime. The dime novels included, usually they were sort of tales of one particular person, so the exploits of Jesse James or Billy the Kid or something like that. But it also sort of gave birth to the heroic detective. That you had these detective dime novels who's a Garrison Keillor. If you ever listen to Garrison Keillor, Prairie Home Companion, he has his, I can't remember what the guy's name is, Dark Noir or Noir Dark, or that's kind of a satire based on that heroic detective. So visual media, and it sounds funny to say this, but visual media actually starts with commercial radio, which is not visual, but radio starts in the 1920s and really quickly establishes itself as the sort of first on-the-scene live news medium. And it originated sort of what we recognize in TV now, the half-hour broadcast with news, weather, and sports. And a lot of the early television shows were based on radio shows. So Dragnet, for example, was originated with live radio. They use these sort of news themes. They had these radio noir programs. Like if you ever listen to old time radio, they play it late night on public radio. These sort of detective stories or crime thrillers with the sound effects and the music. They had stuff they used to make gloopy sounds for head severing, for cracking bones, and so on and so forth. So the first really ability to add that dramatic element regarding crimes. By the 30s, films began to dominate. One of the first talkie films ever was a gangster film. When I taught this class face-to-face in the summer, we used to have retirees, people in their 70s and 80s that would come and just take a class for the fun of it. And I'm playing up this because we actually watched it in class. I'm like, this is one of the first films ever to have, talking parts, and, it was a movement away from the silent film and blah, blah, blah. And they're all like, well, what film is it? And I said the title, and they're all like, oh, yeah. They had seen that film as kids. The big game changer, obviously, was the advent of film. You think even nowadays, like what percent of films are related to crime and criminal justice content? In modern novels, obviously TV, since its inception, has relied heavily on crime. And TV was a big game changer because it really started to cross language lines, cultural barriers. By the 1930s, 2/3 of Americans go to the movies. By 1971, in TVs, the household ratio reaches 1-to-1. That is, almost every TV has a house, or every TV has a house. Every house has a TV. and TV becomes a staple, and it remains a staple even now with all the social media and all of the options. There's a lot of Americans that rely on TV, and especially even broadcast TV. Crime shows have always been a staple. They have tended to make up roughly, they made up 1/3 of all primetime shows in the 50s. Content peaked in the 70s. Almost 40% of the entertainment content in the ABC, NBC, CBS was crime or criminal justice. And you still see that. You flip on TV now in primetime, you're going to find all the NCIS's, Law and Orders. I don't even know what's out there anymore. Bones, on and on and on. You're going to find detectives, forensics, the sort of things that have always been staple of entertainment TV. So legacy media, what they had in common was that they're produced by some entity and distributed to some audience. In that sense, the audience is sort of passive, and they didn't have a lot to choose from. And so these things were broadcast. That is, they had to be fairly vanilla. They had to appeal to a wide variety of people. That transition, the big sort of linchpin, the transition between legacy media and the new media was the era of pay TV or cable TV. I still remember when we called it pay TV. Like in my neighborhood, like only the rich people got to have pay TV and cable TV. It was very much not standard. We used to all go over to my friend's house that had cable to watch MTV or whatever else was on. And it's a big sort of transition and big linchpin because it represents a move from broadcasting to narrowcasting. So you for the first time, you have literally like criminal justice TV. Eventually, something called court TV, it's now called True TV, emerges that is all about court cases and criminal justice agencies. And so you have the emergence of sort of ideologically split news TV, Fox News versus MSNBC, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the start of the leap away from one legacy model, and it's sort of the in-between to what is now the new media. So new media would include the web, social media, apps, interactive gaming, and so on and so forth. How is it unique? We're going to talk about this a bunch in the class, but it's unique because it's interactive. That, you think of something like Facebook, people upload content and share it with other people. The public's literally deciding what things to upload and what things they want to pay attention to. And that sort of, as I said, when we talked about ideology, relates to that narrowcasting, that people tend to select things that are consistent with what they're interested in, what they want to hear, and to avoid things that conflict with what they want to hear. This whole idea of sort of an active consumer as contributor model is very different from that old top-down model where some agency produced content. And there's an upside and downside to that the upside of sort of a produced content, just use an example of like news media. When we talk about news media, a lot of students say, well, I get my news online. I get it through Facebook. But Facebook's just sort of a distributor. When you click on those links, where does it go to? Does it go to Fox News? Does it go to MSNBC? Does it go to some news magazine? Does it go to some propaganda outlet? Is it actual news, or is it a made up sort of fake story that somebody planned it? The upside of having a top down model is that you had editorial boards that had certain thresholds for sourcing and for evidence for their news story. The downside is that editorial board could often act as a filter and filter out sort of news that they didn't want to get out, or if they had a bias, news that was inconsistent with their bias. So these are issues that are going to come up over and over again with respect to the new media. So the important point is, you no longer have to appeal to this sort of large generic audience that as long as you can attract even a small but consistent audience, it's often enough to make money and survive. Um, so, um, all right. In terms of content, Surratt points this out. Robinson points this out. It's something that's often overlooked. If you look at what's out there in mass media, by far, the biggest chunk of advertising is their biggest chunk of content is advertising. It's the literally lifeblood of media. Um, Medias are corporations that exist to make money. So the trend has been that there's been more advertising and much more sophisticated advertising. So rather than the hokey ads of the 1950s and 60s, you now have ads that are placed on Facebook based or web browsers based on sort of what you've clicked on in the past. So if you search for something to buy and you give up on it, the next time you open up your web browser or scroll through Facebook, it's going to have ads for what you were looking for before or things that are related to what you were looking for before. You have placement of things in movies that they're not. It's not an ad. It's just people are using that product in movies. You have, I've seen things where they have just sort of plants that are walking around a city like New York City using a new piece of technology and like having to be like, isn't this cool? Look at this, and not on the face advertising, but essentially being a living, walking advertiser. Internet reviews are some of my favorite that companies now have bots or real people that just blog and blog and blog on review sites to build up a certain product. My dad, he goes to something called Bowsite every day, and every time I talk to him, everybody on Bowsite is bragging up this new product, and I'm, Dad, how do you know? It's probably like three dudes that started this company that are going on as like J-Dog 1 and Frankie 2 and building up these products. It's even to the point. It's one of the more depressing things I saw is my son and my daughter a couple of years ago were playing this game where you had to look at a logo, a brand, and figure out what it was. So was it an advertisement for Mercedes or Fuji and I was distressing how many brands they could identify as at the time, like 8 and 10-year-old kids. So. Um, the main point of media is to sell and make money, and what they sell is essentially us. They sell an audience, and that has important implications for a lot of what we're going to talk about. News, so the other, in terms of content, aside from advertising, are news, entertainment, and infotainment. So news is essentially supposed to be, what's going on in society, what's current, what are sort of the true facts and the objective information about significant events in society. And as we'll see with respect to crime, the respect to news reporting, the most common crime coverage is this idea, a crime has occurred. If it's television news, it's going to be, a film of a police tape or a gurney, or it's going to be an interview with law enforcement, arrest has happened, and so on and so forth. Crime has always been a part of the news, as I alluded to, that quote from the 1500s that I alluded to earlier. It really picked up with the penny press and the crime blotter, and when newspapers figured out that crime sells, that's a big turning point for newspapers. And to this day, newspapers, we'll talk about this when we talk about news. We have a whole class on that. But one of the issues if you have a newspaper or like a CNN, a 24-hour news channel, is you have this giant news hole that you have to fill every single day. And the nice part about crime is that it's always happening somewhere. And so if you have blank pages or 10 minutes of time to fill, there's always some crime that people are going to be interested in for some reason that happened somewhere. And so it's become the great filler for news holes. So we'll talk about that. And because of that, the news sort of tends to focus on very specific forms of crime. In terms of entertainment, the best guess now is that crime and criminal justice make up about a quarter of all entertainment media, which is pretty astounding if you think about it, in terms of television dramas, movies, what's on the New York Times bestseller list for fiction. I guarantee you there's going to be a chunk of books about serial killers and the detectives that track them down. And the entertainment media, and we'll talk about this, has a very sort of common list of frames and narratives. The social injustice narrative, the police hands are tied, so that's why crime happens narrative. The drug use leads to crime narrative, and so we'll talk about all those sorts of frames as well. The sort of latest entry into this, and the one that tends to disturb currentologists who study this stuff the most, is this idea of infotainment. And as the word suggests, it's a sort of blending or meshing of news and entertainment. That the feel you get from watching it is that you're seeing something real and true and objective. And in reality, it's a really heavily edited piece of entertainment that uses, how do you get the feel that it's real? Well, it uses live footage. Examples are things like the television show Cops, right? So you get dash cam vids and handheld cam vids that follow the police officers around. And it's all this live footage, but what you sort of don't think about is to that they add dramatic music. They cut and switch the order of events. They add stock footage. They add sound effects. That it really is sort of edited using all the tools you would use for a Hollywood movie. And in that sense, it's sort of heavily edited and filtered and sort of packaged in a very purposeful way to get people to get interested and to watch more shows. So it disturbs criminologists because people tend to think they're getting this unedited slice of reality, and in fact, they're getting a very heavily edited slice. So we'll talk a bit about that in sort of the middle of the class. We'll talk about the show To Catch a Predator. We'll talk about shows like Cops, and there's some good articles about how those shows are created that we're going to discuss. All right, so a couple things I did want to point out in Surratt is, before I do that, back up. That's the reason I'm stumbling is I found a part of my notes. It's all about news. Make sure when we talk about news, and I'll highlight this again, that you come back and read the first chapter in Surratt. He packs so much in there. But there's different models to explain sort of how the news media covers crime and why they cover crime in that way. A lot of it is sort of just bureaucratic necessity, and that's that idea of a news hole. But there are other issues. There's sort of a market model and a manipulative model and so on and so forth. So we'll return to that later. All right, Robinson. As I said, a slightly more critical / radical view of the media, but some good stuff in there, some stuff worth talking about. And it uses sort of different language to describe a lot of the stuff that Surratt was describing. And so one of the points that I think is worthwhile is he talks about these rings, these three rings of media. And he's a lot, for the most part, talking about news media. And so in that inner ring, you have the Fox, the NBC, Time Magazine, New York Times, these sort of mainstream or major news sources. They have a sort of outsized influence because they essentially set the agenda. They sort of decide what counts as what's newsworthy, what everybody else should be covering. So, if the New York Times is covering something extensively, other outlets feel like they have to also cover that in order to compete. And so there's this tendency for those inner ring sources to start copying each other. And in that sense, they can sort of set an agenda and drum up a bunch of interest. So right now, the Russia scandal and whether there's collusion with the Trump campaign and everything, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and some other inner ring news organizations are really saturating the media right now with those stories, and everybody else is covering it, and so on and so forth. None of this is necessarily good or bad. It's just worth sort of pointing out that you do have this sort of bigwigs that control a lot of the influence. Now, some of that has been blotted out by the changes that have happened. In some ways, it's gotten better. In some ways, it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse, I think most people would argue, and one of the issues is that those media sources, the mainstream sources, have become really almost hyper consolidated. That, back in the 1980s, you had over 50 major news corporations out there, media corporations, not just news corporations. In current times, you have these sort of just handful, 5 or 6 mega corporations that own a bunch of different media. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because it's led to this sort of, more bland, more consistent coverage. You lose your local flavor. You lose sort of critical ways of looking at what's going on in society. And so Robinson talks about sort of 2 different forms. I'll give you one example. So horizontal integration or consolidation refers to a single corporation that buys or controls sort of a single market, so a radio market or a television market. And it's happened both in radio. Something like Clear Channel can buy up all the local radio stations, and so that no matter what you hear, you're hearing it from Clear Channel. And it's all going to sound the same no matter where you are, and you're going to hear the same sort of message. Nowhere receives more than newspapers. When I was a kid, Green Bay, where I grew up, had a morning newspaper and evening newspaper. They were competitors. Now they're down to one newspaper. Big corporation, Gannett, bought out both newspapers and sort of combined news staffs. And what happens is, without that competition and without as much reporting, you sort of lose what you had. Those independent newspapers used to make up 80%, and they're almost all gone now. And so we have a bunch of corporate chains that run. And so the Duluth News Tribune, which I still get, a good chunk of their content is essentially stuff that's just from other newspapers that they reprint in the Duluth News Tribune. Obviously, there's still some local content and local flavor and local reporting, but there used to be much more, and so a lot of people are concerned about that. Part of Robinson's point is that as media has gotten sort of more corporate and more profit-oriented, it's lost some of its role as a watchdog, that the media should be a sort of check on the executive and judicial branches of our government, that it's this sort of fourth leg of the stool, that you need it there as sort of a representative of the public. And so as it's gotten more sort of fluffy and tabloid oriented, you've lost some of that checks and balances that it has on government. So horizontal would be, buying up all the newspapers. Vertical would be sort of controlling a bunch of different corporations and sort of using them to play off each other. A non-media example is like Taco Bell and Pizza Hut and Pepsi, right? So in Taco Bell, you can only get Pepsi product, and so Taco Bell and Pizza Hut merge together, they can start sort of playing off each other and create this sort of synergy. In that example, obviously, it's not that big of a deal. But there's a great example of research that looked at, just trying to dig at, does this matter? Does it matter that the same company might own a bunch of businesses and a newspaper that reports on those businesses? Is that going to affect how they report? And so the example, I looked at reviews of movies that you see in every newspaper. So did the movie get 3 stars or 4 stars? Was it positive or negative? And what they found was that if a company, same corporation, produced a movie and had a newspaper that did a review, the reviews were much more favorable and within the newspapers that were owned by the corporation that made the movie, right? Which makes sense. But the question you're asked is, if you do that for movies, what else are you doing that for? So Robinson points out that the issue is that you may not cover crime, for example, that applies to your corporation or corporate crime in general. And there's pressures to sort of report on certain things and not report on other things. Even PBS, a few years back, had a documentary on the Koch brothers, who are billionaires that have funded a lot of conservative efforts. And they also fund a lot of science and technology, and they also contribute to PBS. And so when they got wind that PBS was going to run this, they pressured PBS and said, we'll withdraw our funding. And so PBS did not run I think the movie was called Citizen Coke. It did get sort of pushed out on a different outlet, but nowhere near as many people would have saw it had it been produced by PBS. So, the concern is you get this sort of vanilla, similar content across all media. There's less local coverage, there's less depth or context to stories, and then there's lack of critical coverage. And the other big example Robinson uses is this idea of military spending, and it's come up. There's I don't know, things have changed so fast, but for a while, last couple of weeks, they're talking about military spending and our military being underfunded. Well, as Robinson would point out, in sort of the bigger contextual things, what we don't often hear is that our military is essentially we spend more money than the next 7 countries combined. So our spending in the U.S. is more than Russia and England and Australia and everybody else combined. And so his concern is that we sort of have come to lack that critical coverage. He also has a different take on kind of how the media filters out certain content. And so he talks about, because media are profit-seeking, they're going to avoid things that are controversial, that are going to turn off advertisers. So you've seen a bit of this with Fox News, right? Bill O'Reilly getting pulled off the air, people getting driven out of the company. A lot of this happened because advertisers either threatened to pull out or did pull out. And so media has to kind of cater to those advertisers, and it's going to affect the content of what they do. The other thing that happens with the media, especially news media, is that they rely, because it's easy, because it's a bureaucratic fit, they rely on official sources. So with respect to crime, they're going to rely on police, on politicians, and those folks have a particular take, which is different than perhaps folks living in the areas where crime is happening, or victims of crime, or scientists, or other forces. And finally, he has a very different take on what most people think when they think of bias. One of the things that's happened with the narrowcasting and the splintering is conservatives have been sort of uber successful branding particular. You think of Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity. So you can go to AM talk radio and get essentially 24/7 conservative news reporting. Just unabashedly, we're doing a conservative flavor of this. And part of what they've done is say, look, the mainstream media is all liberal and we're the only conservative source. And so it depends on your perspective. If you see the mainstream media as sort of mainstream vanilla, you tend to see the Fox News and the conservative radio as just flat out conservatism. Liberals have been less successful. You have your MSNBC, but you don't have that sort of 24/7 talk radio that's become popular, that's geared towards liberals. And so part of Robinson's point is that conservatives have been pretty successful at essentially sort of working their reps and saying, the mainstream media is all liberal. And so the mainstream media feels kind of compelled to really cover themselves and not appear liberal and not appear that they're bashing conservatives. And so take Robinson for what he's worth. He's coming from that perspective. You could find a text from conservative that might make the opposite case. But it is true, and we will talk about this, that there has become this sort of tit for tat, that if you have an article on global climate change, that you also have to have somebody that disagrees with you and give them the same sort of weight of evidence. So his point is that media has sort of taken the easy road to avoid being accused of bias. All right. stepping back and sort of asking the bigger questions, why does this stuff matter? Well, it matters because most of the public has no sort of direct reality about crime and criminal justice. Most of us become victims of some minor form of crime, but not something like homicide. Most of us don't do time in prison or jail, so we don't have a sense of what it's like. Most of us don't get charged with a serious crime. So the public's version of reality for a lot of crime and justice comes from the media. And that becomes problematic if the media gives us a filtered, distorted view of crime. And so the other issue is that the media is an agenda setter, that what the public thinks is the most important problem often relates to what's being covered by the variety of media that we have. If heroin use, which is now, becomes this huge issue and all the media is reporting about it, public's antenna are going to go up and they're going to start thinking about it as an important problem. This has been especially true for drugs. We had marijuana panics, we had crack cocaine in the 80s, methamphetamines in the early 2000s. Those drugs are still there. It's that the media isn't really shining a light on them like they used to. The real concern is that you end up with policy, we'll talk about examples of this, that are based more on sort of the distorted media reality of crime than the actual issues that lead to crime and the actual problems of criminal justice. So, all right, it's a little longer-winded than I wanted to do. A couple of things I want to point out. Obviously it's not face-to-face, but when I teach this face-to-face, a couple things always comes up. Well, one is that students always decry this horrible media that, they're distorting this stuff, and I guess I just engaged in a little bit of that. But the other side of the coin is that the media will say, look, we're giving people what they want. People like crime dramas. They like crime news. They want to hear about murders, especially if it's something horribly dramatic or a celebrity or something else that makes it newsworthy. So is it that media is sort of jamming fast food down our throats, or is it that we're demanding the fast food from the media? A sort of related point is that I hear students all the time saying the media wants us to believe this, or media wants us. Well, the media wants one thing. It's the same thing as every other corporation. It wants money. And if people consumed different forms of media, somebody would step up to fill that void. And so it's really not that the media is trying to convince you of something, and it's that the media is sort of marketing you, right? You are what it's selling. You're the audience. So people do have a say and have a role in that. One of the I'm thinking off the top of my head, one of the things that comes up, for example, is in other countries, when you have somebody that commits mass murder, their names and often their photographs don't appear in any sort of mainstream media, and so the idea is we don't want to sort of reward somebody for doing this by making them famous. Whereas in the U.S., we sort of splash their mugshot all over the place and write articles about them and so on and so forth. So, all right, that's enough for that.